Now, I know exactly what you are thinking when you clicked on this video. I've seen this video or a style like this 1,000 times before. I get it. Season 8 sucks. Season 8 makes no sense. Season 8 is terrible. But I would argue Game of Thrones' problems stem much deeper than just Season 8. In fact, I would say Season 8 is just a symptom of the disease, or, well, you could say the problem with Game of Thrones. As Game of Thrones' biggest issues strive from its ideology and even going back as far as the books itself. One of the things about Game of Thrones is people forget how big that show actually was during its heyday. This wasn't just another show you watched on HBO or Netflix. Maybe you talked about it a little bit with your friends. This is a show that got millions and millions and millions of views online before that became a huge thing for like Marvel movies to do or anything like that. This was the show that everybody used to talk about. And I actually remember the first episode with it, and I was drawn in. I thought it was a fascinating show right from the beginning. And I was a lot younger and I didn't quite understand everything. But as the show went along, I always caught every single episode. I always watched it. And it was a growing show. Every single year it had more and more fans, as what you want. But the show didn't explode until season 3. And everybody knows what happens in season 3, or what happened in season 3, that of the Red Wedding. I really think people have forgotten how good this show was and how big this show really was during its heyday. I mean, Game of Thrones, if you've seen it, obviously it combines great characters, an interesting story, as well as a plot that keeps you on your toes, at least during the first couple of seasons. It really made you think and wonder, okay, what is going to happen next? Now, I remember watching the first episode way back in 2011, and it was a great show. I've always been into fantasy series, so this was right up my alley. But it never seemed to get very much fanfare during the first maybe 2 seasons, even a little bit of the third season. Now, the show was gaining popularity through each one of them, slowly but surely, but it wasn't until one event that changed everything for the show. And I would say it's the biggest turning point for the books as well. And for those who've seen it, they know it. It's the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding wasn't just a big plot point that happened. It was an event. It was something that people wouldn't stop talking about. It wasn't something that you talk about with your friends like one day or 2 days. This is something that kept on people's minds for weeks, months, and it gained so much. It probably quadrupled the fanfare for Game of Thrones and put the hype through the roof for season 4. Now, after the Red Wedding, this is when reaction videos on YouTube started blowing up. Everybody had a reaction video in this one event with this mass casualty of all the deaths of most of the Starks. This was the one event that made reaction videos a huge IP on YouTube. This what made it huge. And then right after that, too, is when, to my opinion, and this is when you started seeing the big theory videos. This is when those started taking off as well. They were so shocked by the Red Wedding, they had to go, okay, well, what's going to happen next? And what's going to happen next? So by the time season 4 came around, they were full speed ahead. They had national acclaim, and everybody was interested in the show. Everybody wanted a piece of George R. R. Martin, and everybody wanted to see what was going to happen next. They already knew they had interesting plot, but the thing that made everybody want to stick around with Game of Thrones, far and away, George R. R. Martin's best quality as a writer is his characters. How human he makes them feel, how much of their heart you actually see. Even a character as evil as Cersei Lannister, you can see that she cares more about her children than she does anybody else. Now, she goes about it the worst possible way, but she cares. You can see her heart. And you can definitely see, from her perspective, why she does the things she does. That's George R. R. Martin's greatest strength. Now, one of the big criticisms against him, and one of the things I started seeing when I started really worse, one of the big things I started seeing when I started watching the show more, one of the things I started to see with the show was this big criticism of Lord of the Rings. Now, they said Lord of the Rings was almost childish in their opinion, saying infamously, saying infamous, saying infamously that, well, Lord of the Rings isn't that sophisticated. I mean, hobbits never even popped a boner. Something just so lowbrow and so disrespectful to the works of J.R. Tolkien. But Lord of the Rings didn't need that to be enthralling. It was a great story. It had great characters as well. But there almost seemed to be this, I don't want to say hatred, but definitely a looking down upon. That we've moved past this. This is more mature. That was for little kids. These are for the adults. Now, here's a big issue with that as well. One of the big criticisms George R. R. Martin had against Game of Thrones was, well, it doesn't really take into consideration that ideology of what does it mean to be a good leader? What does it mean to even be a good man? Infamously, George R. R. Martin asked about Aragorn's Infamously, George R. R. Martin asked about what is Aragorn's tax policy and what does it mean to be a great leader? Now, those are somewhat interesting questions to ask. They were kind of answered in the text themselves. These are interesting questions to ask, but as we will later on see, they never get answered. In fact, that very critique George R. R. Martin had against J.R.R. Tolkien was going to get blown up in his face tenfold. Now, during Game of Thrones' height of its popularity, during its most anticipated season, obviously going from season 7 to 8, Daenerys coming back to Westeros was a huge expectation upon the show. But to me, I would also say the end of season 4, because it's like, where do you go from there? And as far as the books go, that's the end of book 3. Now, this is where I want to talk about the books, because at the end of book 3, there was a huge problem going from book 3 to book 4 and book 5. That problem was it felt as if though the story was nearing its end and had maybe one more book to go. But as far as we stand now, there were supposed to be 3 more books in between the book 3 and book 7. Now, why does it feel this way? Well, it's because some of the major characters have kind of reached their zenith as far as climbing. Now we have to go to the climax and then end it. If you look at Daenerys, she essentially had all her dragons. So what are you supposed to do? Well, you kind of find a way to take away the dragons, take away her army, and make her start off from the very beginning again. But that kind of doubles back on her story. So what do you do from there? Same thing with Jon Snow. He became the Lord Captain of the Night's Watch. Well, what do you do? Well, I guess you kind of kill him, maybe. So you kind of have to double back on all these great accomplishments. So instead of feeling as if though they're constantly going somewhere, it feels as if though they get halfway there, fall all the way back to the beginning, and have to re-go back to the very end, or have to go back towards the end. But this makes it repetitive as a viewer and a reader. Many of the people's stories felt again as if though, hey, there's one more book and that needs to be the ending. And to me personally, I believe that Game of Thrones should have had only about 4 books, simply due to the fact that much of the political ideologies that Game of Thrones was going after seemed to wrap up by the end of by the end of book 3. So you really only have the magical stuff, the war with the White Walkers, and Daenerys' return to Westeros to really deal with. But it felt as if, though, especially with book 4, that was much more padded filler in order for George to get to 7 books. Which, sure, it matters the number of the books. People like a trilogy, but is it super necessary to have the books be 7 long when you stretch out the story and in many ways destroy it? The answer is clearly no. Now, why has George struggled with books 4 and 5 is because of, just as I said, the feeling of completion. Where do you go if it's complete? How many more stories can you tell of a character that's, over 1,000 pages long with a big cast of characters that seems to always be getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And so now it wins a winner. It's going to be about 1,500 pages for this one book. probably maybe more than that, maybe about 2,000 pages. That's a huge book. That's more pages than the Bible. That's an insane amount. And it's hard even for the most dedicated of fans to keep track of, okay, who's this character? What's this character? Who's this? Who's that? Who's that? Who is this? When you have this many, and it's like, where do you go from there? Is A Dream of Spring going to be 3,000 pages long? You know, it comes to a point where there's just too much. There's too many stories going on, and there's too much double backing with the characters and their arcs. And I think that's the big reason why he's struggling so badly with Winds of Winter. Not only that, but it's no surprise that after Dance of Dragons, when they made the show, fan expectation for the next book has been skyrocketing. So if you're George R. R. Martin, not only do you have the issue of trying to wrap up a story that seems somewhat complete, now you have the fan expectation. And then on top of that, you have the horribleness of season 8 to deal with. Well, where do you go from there? You're so confused, you're so angry, and not just at the show creators, but at yourself. Because whether people, and I understand where it comes from, the showrunners have a hand of responsibility for how badly that goes, how badly that show was. I mean, the dialogue, the character interactions, the arcs, it failed. But George did not give them sufficient amount of information as well as material to go off of. He swore that the sixth book would have been out by at least season 5. That never happened. So you can sit up here and blame these characters and these guys for the failure, but at the end of the day, George's responsibility for keeping his end of the bargain as well was completely failed. But here comes the biggest issue with Game of Thrones. And it's the moral grayness that drew everybody into the show. Well, everybody likes the idea of very complicated characters, and a moral conundrum can be very interesting for a show, especially a political one, as Game of Thrones was. If everybody's this moral grayness and there's nobody admirable, you tend to kind of fall into pits of darkness with them. Many people do not know this, but Tyrion from the books, once he left Westeros, he wasn't this kind of guy on a redemption arc the way he was portrayed maybe in the show. He was very angry, very angry. He wanted to kill people. He wanted to kill the rest of his family. He became that monster that everybody thought he was. And to me, that kind of represents the full arc of where all these characters are going, to where you might admire them, but now they become a monster. So instead of viewing the world as the good versus the monsters, now you're viewing the world as humanity becoming the monsters. And this is a huge issue because if you see some of these great characters and they all fall from grace, well, it's going to have a very negative effect on people's opinion. And people don't want to see a very nihilistic portrayal of anything. Most people honestly want a happy ending. And I don't think you need to have a sunshine and rainbows, but to have the ending where it seemed like nothing mattered, the way Game of Thrones did, you shouldn't be surprised that everything falls apart. Back to George R. R. Martin's original issue. The big question that he asked about Aragorn's tax policy, well, what policies did Game of Thrones ever talk about when it came to anything political? What issues did they say, okay, maybe lesser taxes work. Maybe this policy works. They never discussed any of that. Because the problem with Game of Thrones was it was a Machiavellian struggle for power. That was it. Everybody, most people at least, were self-interested only in gaining power, not about saving the realm. And while you obviously are going to have characters like that, it always felt as if that was it. It was just a struggle of power. And that wanting to save the world or do something heroic or save your country, the way Lord of the Rings was portrayed, of having these great moral and strong characters with these great attitudes and these great attributes, was no longer venerated. So it ended up destroying much of the heroic nature that fantasy can so greatly portray. Not only this, but you have the issue of, at the end of the story, and this is confirmed what's going to be for the books as well, Brandon Stark is going to become the king. The character with the worst arc, one of the most boring plots, and one of the most uninteresting characters. But what qualities, as George R. R. Martin criticized J.R.R. Tolkien of, give Brandon Stark the right to become king? What qualities make him great? Maybe he's somewhat smart, but is he smarter than Tyrion? No. Is he more noble than Jon? No. Does he have a better birthright than Daenerys? No. None of these great qualities he possesses. And yet we're supposed to believe that he should be king for no other reason than he has some powers. And it's this failing that makes Game of Thrones feel as if it was going nowhere. And have this empty feeling once you're at the end of season 8, and probably at the end of A Dream of Spring, where you look back at all these great moments and plots, and you say, it was all for naught. Because it ended with no answers for any of these questions. And a sense of emptiness, that everybody who you cared for died. That everybody you cared for died. And that we're on to the next one. That's that. And it's this empty moral grayness that even from the very beginning of the story, even the beginning of the books, it's actually very ironic, the critique that George R. R. Martin gave about Lord of the Rings, about its moral black and whiteness, and due to its simplicity of its plot. Simply due to a letter that J.R.R. Tolkien had written long since before Game of Thrones was even thought of, critiquing a possible sequel that had about 100 pages written before Tolkien gave up on it. The sequel would have been titled A New Shadow. And in it, he wrote in a letter about it and why he gave up on it. I did begin a story set about 100 years after the downfall of Sauron, but it proved both sinister and depressing. Since we are dealing with men, it is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable features of their nature, their quick satiety with good, so that the people of Gondor in times of peace, justice, and prosperity would become discontented and restless, while the dynasts descended from Aragorn would become just kings and governors, like Denethor or worse. I found that even so early, there was an outcrop of revolutionary plots about a center of secret, satanistic religion, while Gondorian boys were playing at being orcs and going around doing damage. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would have been just that, not worth doing. Ironically enough, the plot of politics, overthrowing somebody, and plotting against the normal humans was thought of as boring and thought of not worth doing for J.R.R. Tolkien. An ironic twist in the story of Game of Thrones and fantasy in general.